we're ready. And thank you so much, both Christy and Chris. I'd like to invite people whose names are so similar onto a podcast at the same time. But I want to acknowledge, first of all, that this episode is going to be focused on historical information related to challenge courses, and came about because Christy presented at our High Five Symposium and then also at the Project Adventures SEL Symposium on this topic. And there was a lot of positive buzz that I was hearing from people saying, oh my God, you have to learn more about this. You have to listen to this. So I was excited for the opportunity to be able to bring Christy on. And Chris Damboise's role here is not only the director of training, but he was an attendee in one of those workshops and was one of the people who had great positive sharings about what he'd learned in that and its relationship to our industry. And so I also want to add, before we start, I noticed in your notes there was content warning. So I'm going to add the content warning for this episode. And I'm going to mention that there are going to be topics of war, racism, white supremacy, imperialism will be touched upon in this content. So I'm going to go to Chris first and just ask for your overall thoughts as you kind of conveyed them to me post you attending the workshop that Christy had led.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I was speaking with my colleague Lisa this morning, and because she knows you, Christy, and she knew sort of the content of what we were getting at, I just said, the power of it for me became readily apparent when I realized how engaged I was. And then my colleague Anne Louise was also in this and how engaged she was. And then we happened to be in the same sort of work group that you put us into. And I realized we were coming at it from two completely different angles and having the same powerful experience. Anne Louise with a social justice lens in her way of thinking about the work we do. And then my historical lens of my time in the field and my connection to, past experiences with Outward Bound in sort of the growth of this industry. So I just found the marriage of the history of the development of challenge courses and your lens of asking the hard questions around what are the roots of this socially, politically, and then how does that include or exclude people, and what do we need to think about in terms of the frameworks in which we work. So I just found it incredibly powerful.
Yeah. So Christy, now we get to hear from you.
Yeah.
So I'd love to, even before we maybe get into the content, what was the origin for you wanting to talk about this topic? There was obviously a desire to start sharing this information. Where did that come from?
So when I was in college and we were learning about challenge courses, we had a one-day lecture that talked about the very brief history of challenge courses and basically where they came from. And then in the 10 years since that I've been a part of the challenge course field, no one that I've ever talked to has ever heard the names that I mentioned that we learned about in that history session, or knew anything about where they came from. And I felt like the origins felt really important and part of the discussion that we just never talk about. In the last few years, as the challenge course field has been doing a lot of thinking about accessibility, and DEIB has become more buzzwords. It's this really ties into the origins of challenge courses, and it's an aspect of the field that we don't talk about, and I want us to have those conversations. And even if it's just being aware of the information as step one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, I've been in the field a long time, and as I look upon the list that you shared, I realized how little I knew. And there are names that I'd never heard of. I'd heard of Outward Bound, I've heard of Kurt Hahn, but beyond that, I didn't really know anymore. And it's partly because I hadn't sorted out, but also hasn't been shared. It's not something that typically comes up for people. So let's get in really I hate to try to narrow it and reduce the amount of information you want to share, because we could talk for a long time, but this is their opportunity to really kind of share maybe the big pull-up points as you developed them and maybe you found out. So what is ultimately the history of the challenge course?
I think in the broad scheme, the challenge course as we know it today came out of military training and physical fitness. And specifically, it came out of the French military and their experiences, specifically the experiences of Georges Hébert, who then transformed how the military was trained, and we got obstacle courses out of that, and then focus on physical fitness within education and moral character as part of that training, which then transformed into using it in physical activity, in training and summer camps and thinking about really there's the theory at the time of like fitness needs to happen because we are very rich and lazy and we don't do very much. And challenge courses and the obstacle courses were a way to recreate the movements that people who do physical labor do. And that is a way to improve individually and as well as a collective. And then the role and purpose of that challenge course and obstacle course changed over time with the interest and need of war and good combatants and integrated into Outward Bound and that military and naval training. And then it came into wanting to take that aspect of Outward Bound and the like skills there into a classroom education setting with Project Adventure and integrating into a physical education curriculum. And then the last 50 years, how we've continued to transform how we use a challenge course for group development. And whole side tangent on the sometimes called like the pay to play, but the adventure park experience. Like I'm skipping over so much information and trying to condense this and very much tangenting because I remember other parts that are so influential to the history. It's very much all intertwined in a lot of ways.
It's interesting as I think about, I remember having a conversation with Hutch Hutchinson, who we both know, about the history of outdoor ed. And there was this, it was clearly designed at one point to educate in a way, public school education in a way to prepare students for the industrial age. How do we prepare people to work in factories? It feels like, as you're suggesting, there was a lot of military design around this.
Yeah.
What was the kind of impact on that in the populations that existed at the time?
So it started out with like the military, and Georges Hébert created his idea, the natural method, natural method, which had pillars of education, one of which was physical, which was where the like challenge course precursors slot in. And while that component was developed in the military and Georges Hébert applied the natural method to military training, he then wrote papers about it and sent it out into the physical education world, who had a mixed response of excitement as well as some thinking in the Western world. Around France, there was excitement, and in Europe. But in places like Brazil, when this information was received, it was not received well because a lot of like the ideas were great, but the way that Georges Hébert described the people, because he described people as what's the exact quote? I wrote it down in one of my notes. Savages. He was describing people as savages. The people in Martinique, people in Martinique who were doing physical fitness, he was describing them as savages and as other like really derogatory terms, or as society today describes it as derogatory, but also the indigenous folks in the communities were like, that's not a great way to describe me. And so they rejected the ideas and postulations that were being shared because of the way that Georges Hébert was describing it. Like partial, like tangential side of the way it was received was that part of the natural method is that physical fitness can be for everyone and that it's not just for men. And so it was also women were also trained in the method, doing the exact same movements, exact same like attire. And in like that way, Georges Hébert's like ideas were similar to pre-World War I feminist discourse in the ideas and values of women, that it was more than just French society at the time frequently thought of women as dolls, essentially. Of that they should sit there, be pretty, and do these very limited things. Georges Hébert was part of they can actually do physical things aspect.
So he seems like he was a forward-thinking person in one regard and maybe not in another with the savage comment. Is the savage piece, was it his opinion or was it just of the time that was the way it was described?
A mix. I don't personally, there's not much to be able to know exactly what is his opinion and what is collective understanding at the time. But when Georges Hébert was serving as a military officer, and naval officer specifically, in the Caribbean, he wrote a lot of things about observing the guerrillas of Uruguay and the coal women, and the like terms used to describe them are not very flattering. And there's a lot of, in his books, there's a lot of comparisons between Black bodies and white bodies, and kind of in the social space at the time, this moment when the Black body is in vogue as like a circus act and a novelty more than humanization, as very much an othering experience.
I found it fascinating that because I had done, I worked for Outward Bound for quite some time and knew a lot about the Kurt Hahn history and having spent some time with Karl Ronke early in my career at PA, knew a little bit about Hébert, but did not know anything about, I'm trying to remember, is it Yvonne Moreau or something?
Yeah, Yvonne Moreau.
Right. This woman comes out of the middle of nowhere that I've never heard of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that a reoccurring theme where women have a role, but they're kind of hidden behind the veil, so to speak?
Generally a thing in history.
Right.
In my research, it took a long time to find the first mention of Yvonne Moreau, Yvonne Moreau led the women's annex at the College of Athletics in France at the time that they were instituting the natural method, and was like really one of the big champions and helped co-write one of the books that Georges Hébert published. But her crediting is like half a line and not on the cover, not anywhere. It's known that she contributed to this, but isn't given credit. And then after World War I helped and was like the lead of the La Palestra, which is the like new place that they created as a training ground using the natural method, and was like in charge of that space, but is not really given credit. I think the like biggest place her name is mentioned is in the footnote of an image that includes her at the like one of the body comparisons, as this is a great example of what this method can develop.
I'm seeing as well.
Yeah.
In some of the descriptions, it says like the English translation of l'éducation physique féminine, muscle et but plastique, is the female physical education, muscle and plastic beauty.
Yes.
So that's where that doll-like consideration, I guess, from the concept between the two genders comes from. Fascinating.
Yeah. And the doll-like is the way that like French society was. Doll-like is how Georges Hébert used to describe what women's role was expected to be in there. Yeah.
What's the transition point from, like, clearly this is happening in France in the early 19... So we've got like what's happening here with Hébert and also Moreau in France. And then this seems 20 years or more predates what's maybe happening with Hahn. Where's the transition point? What's happening in French physical education and what happens with Kurt Hahn?
So during World War I, the French military has been using this and it has great success. And then they kind of transition into like, we're just going to focus on the physical training aspect and not think about the rest of the Georges Hébert's natural method, and really focus on just the like military training aspect of obstacle courses, which were the precursor to challenge courses. And so in that like gap of time after World War I, we don't need to train for war anymore. We did it. War's done. And what happens to like get to like the founding of Outward Bound is that there's the start of conflict again, and Marine sailors don't know how to survive on a ship and in that naval space. And Outward Bound was the partnership of I need money, you have money, and I need sailors to be trained to survive. And you know how to do education that happened between Lawrence Holt and Kurt Hahn. And that partnership brought out Outward Bound, which had the first course was sailors for Lawrence Holt's, was training for Lawrence Holt's sailors. And they used ships as part of that in order to be able to like think about how do we work together? How do we survive? What are the physical skills that I need in order to do this? Which is where cargo nets show up. And we start to use more, we've been using naval terms and naval structures, but now they've more been integrated together in addition to just the like physical movements of here's a wall to climb. And we look at modern Hébert courses, or Hébertisme courses. It looks a lot like low elements in the challenge course world, and there's a lot of design overlap between them these days.
I found it fascinating that right around that start, as you explained it, that transition into World War II and the need for Hahn to help support the British seamen to survive, that there were also some Canadians stationed in France at the time that started the war who got trained in Hébert and eventually brought it back. And we see the first sort of camp in North America using a challenge course as early as 1940 something or like that or something.
Yeah.
Which is hard to believe that a camp everybody thinks like, oh, the course Colorado Outward Bound School had in the 60s was the first intervention, but really was a summer camp, if you will,
Yeah.
in Quebec in the 40s.
Yep, 1949. We got the first challenge course in the summer camp, which predates the Colorado Outward Bound challenge course by more than 10 years.
That's fascinating.
And so we had this transition. It's like it's almost like just the use has somewhat changed. We had a war, and that makes sense. They were trying to train people for war, and then we've now realized like, oh, it's an educational tool as well as a production of war, because I need to be able to teach people how to cope with environments. So it became more like not only the physical, but also maybe the mental side of stuff post some of those wars. And then what was that transition between the Outward Bound model, which was clearly designed as educational, but also, taking participants who were struggling in environments and trying to allow them to cope. We've got a summer camp in Canada. How did it become more the way maybe you and I use it in team development stuff? There's, we get to Outward Bound and then where?
So like Outward Bound courses, from my research in the 60s, was a lot of like, it was like a sequential where you go up and you're doing all these obstacles by yourself at height, like a 35-foot rope ladder without belay to get up to height. And then you do this by yourself, and it takes hours to do it. Outward Bound instructors were the first folks building the challenge courses around the country. And in 1971, at Hamilton Wenham High School in Wenham, Massachusetts, is the founding of Project Adventure, which is when Outward Bound folks were like, oh, we could take these ideas from the like challenge course experience in Outward Bound and bring it into a high school. The like morph was from trying to take that big, long experience to get it to fit into a 50-minute PE class. And that's how we got the like shift between big structures that take hours down to what are bite sizes that you can do with a team that involve more people at a time. And you can do it in a shorter block where you don't have the opportunity to just take more time because that bell rings and you have to move to the next class in a high school. It was Jerry Pay and Gary Baker, the like two big people who made that happen. Along with, it was the 9th grade students at the school built the course after school to start out with.
I was actually mentioning to someone in a training recently the idea that a lot of the course elements as we know them today were just built by the participants in a workshop or a training or something that was, use this now the last day to build something. I still recall Jim and talking about him and Carl Ronke in programming, having his participants design the next element they were going to use to then build and make money on. So it was almost developed by the students, which is positive, and then also a great way to try to make some money on the back of making money, which is
well, I think the roots of that, though, go back to the Outward Bound model, where it was service projects. So part of your extended Outward Bound course was not only, doing the ropes course and your expeditions and all those things, but there was a service component. So often you would build trails or build campsites or build challenge course elements for other people.
Yeah, even the first OB challenge course in Marble, Colorado was built by students. It was built by students from Colorado Academy down the street in Denver.
So Chris, as you were going through some of these histories, and what was the stuff that stood out to you as stuff that maybe, and I don't want to highlight you as being around longer than me and Christy, but you are and have been. What's stood out to you as stuff like, wow, I didn't know this stuff. This is very fascinating to me.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. There was a note in here that, I think Christy mentioned this earlier, that like back in the Hébert's time in the French military, they moved away from Hébert's tenets, which include that sort of social component, the group component, and they really focused on just the physical fitness piece. And then during the peace times, they didn't use as much of that natural method. And as soon as the invasion of Afghanistan happened in 2001, and they had to go back to war, they realized that their traditional sports alone had not prepared people to become soldiers again, to become, combatants in war. It's interesting, and I wonder also if we had Hutch and maybe some others sitting here, around the integration into camp environments, I remember watching a PBS episode recently about the infiltration of Nazi methodologies into summer camps in the US. And I think at the time, these early summer camps were probably, in some cases, I suspect, were just many young people getting ready to do hard labor, perhaps go to war eventually, right? So scouting, if you think about that in whatever version that is, if it's the Boy Scouts or whatever that is in England where you grew up, Phil, those all have that sort of regimented militaristic components to them. You get awards and badges and you get your rankings on your sleeve. And so that was just fascinating to me, that I was like, oh, this stuff got embedded in there because there may have been some educational motives, but there were probably lingering other motives around the use of these. And I found that really interesting.
It's kind of interesting as well as you said that, because you said, what's in England? I was a member of the Boys Brigade from age 7 to 18. And the Boys Brigade features in a lot of Europe and also Africa. And it is very militaristic. And I would hazard to say that I wouldn't be surprised if England's courses are still a little bit more militaristic than we have here in the States, in terms of the way they get used. That was certainly my impression when being in England as a kid in the 90s.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's always maybe readily apparent to most people is that because this came out of naval military history, the idea of trees basically substituting for the masts of ships, and of course a modern course where you have a utility pole, which is essentially the same thing as a mast, it just happens to be stuck in the ground and not in the hull of a ship. But that we took many of those sort of ship rigging constructs and brought them to the land to be the physical apparatus in which we engaged. It was just, that's how we fought wars early on. We couldn't move armies around the world with ease, so we had to put people on ships and do battle that way. It's just like, and so those constructs became the physical apparatus that we use to this day in some cases. I remember talking to you, Christy, at the end of your session with us, and I remember asking you, has anybody done research on, I know of a few instances where challenge courses have been built on tall ships, meaning the ships already exist as a, as a construct that have sails and all those things, but they've also then built challenge courses that are specifically designed into the ship apparatus. So it's come full circle. And I just don't know the extent of that. Like, is that like a 1 or 2 off kind of experience, or are there a multitude of, watercraft that now have, challenge courses on them beyond like the Princess, Disney giant floating, what do you call those?
Cruise ships.
Yeah, cruise ships. Certainly cruise ships have become a place where you can stick a challenge course off the side and suspend it overhead and that kind of thing. Yeah, so I just found that fascinating too. Like, I wonder where this is going to go in the future.
Yeah, the movements basics of what Georges Hébert was trying to create an obstacle course for when he got there was to basically mimic what the training that people had out of nature. And so we're mimicking nature out of constructions, making those constructions then work for ships, making those ships then become trees now become ships on trees, and it's a massive cycle, all because guy realized that the European and American trained military folks were not doing as well as the locals during the turn of the 19th century.
It feels like a microcosm of like human beings in general. Like, we see natural landscapes, we destroy them all for our own purposes, build stuff on them, and then do our darndest to try to make nature come back to the places that we've just built on, because we realize there's importance in nature.
Well, it's fascinating. The Olympics just happening recently, right? With all of the different things that people do, right? Mm-hmm. They paddle kayaks, they run really fast, they jump with horses over barriers, they climb plastic blobs attached to climbing walls really fast, right? The idea that even within the the newest sport within the Olympics of climbing, rock climbing, it is a far cry from, we basically have constructed an outdoor environment that people used to scale to get honey out of bees' nests or whatever, to like this inside plasticized environment that now we're hoping people get the benefit of that and then go outside and can perform it outside again. It's that weird dichotomy of how do you attract the most people? Where do you have the most impact? And I think that's where challenge courses took advantage of, not everybody had access to a ship nor military training. So if this was good for people, how could you bring the best of what's there back to where the masses are? And I think, that's the power of PA's intervention those early years in the 70s to get it into public school mainstream education. Probably got it in the hands of a ton more people who would never have access to that. Except what I remember you asking that hard question is who's excluded in all of this?
Yeah. And even in the first case of it works for this core group, let's apply it to everybody. But who is it designed for? If we take the Olympic rock climbing, we're assuming that people who are going to be interested in wanting to do this as a sport aren't the folks who are doing it every day as the climbing to go get the honey from the big rock wall. That sounds like work if I have to do that every day. But if I'm going to go pay $45 and have a 30-minute session, that sounds great. Yeah. So who is it for? Who is it not for?
So let's transition this, because it makes sense maybe to think about with this information that we have and the awareness that clearly there were voices excluded or it was clearly not designed for certain populations. What do we do with this information beyond it being that's cool to know that that's where it came from? But I think sometimes the knowing where it came from allows us to apply it to future. What's your thoughts around what do we do with this?
I think really the first part is make sure that other people know. And as a practitioner, really think about okay, if I'm doing this as an activity, what am I assuming is the challenge by choice of what am I assuming is the background that all these folks have that's both going to have their buy-in, have them be interested in it. And is this even a right thing to be using with this group? Because may or may not have had this, if this was not designed for them, even if we say this is for everybody, does not mean that it actually is. And folks know and can tell when things aren't actually meant for them. I think it's about us as practitioners being really intentional, and I think also being honest with both ourselves and clients, participants about where these things came from, and not just that it's always super great for everybody. It can be a positive experience, but also what does this context bring for people just by being in its space?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that in the last 5 years, and we recently High Five did an internal training on trauma-informed care, that we were noticing that as more people are coming into the course, more access is granted by different areas around how people can access courses, that it comes with it the idea that we need to be much more conscious that people are going to come in and have trauma responses to the environments that we're placing them in, which we're unaware of. I remember doing a lower ups training, and the staff was saying, less kids are wanting to experience the physicality of some of the stuff now than has in the past. More people are advocating for not doing it. And they were almost seeing that sometimes as being a negative thing because it's negatively impacting their program. But ultimately, I was saying, well, that's actually a really positive thing because people are being able to advocate where their comforts lie and stuff like that. So how it's almost a hard transition to persuade people that what they might perceive as a negative thing, people asking more questions, people more resistant, is actually a really positive thing because it demonstrates that you're actually inviting more people into the space.
Well, and I think also what don't they know could allow them to perceive themselves to, because it isn't just is it good for me, but can I perceive myself there? And they might have a good experience if there was an overall availability of a mental model for why people like them could be in those spaces. I think that's the hard thing about the power of adventure is, sometimes we mix up the tools with you can have a powerful group adventure educationally intentional program without a challenge course, right?
Yes.
Well, we know that. And that could be true for many, many groups. Some groups, the use of the course as a tool or a component of the program may amplify some key learnings. And for other groups, it may be a huge barrier for them to continue to engage. And I think that's where modern facilitator or a currently really active program needs to really do high quality needs assessment. Who are their clientele? What are their goals? What are their needs? And then how does that dovetail or not with what a given challenge course program or adventure program can deliver on?
I think it's also about think about our adventure field and who are the people who work on challenge courses and the people who are and the general access, as we've talked about in last 2 years, we've done a lot of making it more accessible for folks. But there's also there's all of this background that is still perpetuating, and it is the folks who have the in the spaces where it's present. Even think of Hamilton Wenham High School is in a very white suburban neighborhood or area that has a decent amount of wealth. It's affluent, and they're the ones who are oh, we had the time. These are some great things we should bring into our community. And thinking about as we have staff and we try and grow the field, what are the things that we need to do as folks trying to grow this space to change how we use things and how we structure, so we don't just perpetuate the origins of who these are for the wealthy white European folks who had a chance to sit back and relax and now needed entertainment and a way to do physical fitness besides sport.
And you could still sense it. It's as you talk about it, I remember, I've done lots of trainings where I'll go to a site and they've been doing the exact same lesson plan for 20 years without any consideration that it needs to be changed, especially if they have the same staff who have been there kind of perpetuating exactly oh, it still works, I've done this for 20 years and I've never dropped anyone. It's kind of a proof of success, rather than realizing oh, I think it's worthy of you questioning your flow, questioning the framing, questioning the way you talk to people. When you hear people say just do this and just do that, and then there does definitely feel like a militaristic kind of approach to the way that I see courses getting used even today. So it definitely is perpetuated. What you said the industry change is the industry sort of went for a pay to play model as well. Is that also feels like it's also perpetuating that, is it not?
Yeah. And all the pay to play, I don't really like the term, but it is the adventure park model didn't come to the US until the 2000s. And some of it's I don't know how much this is your experience of when folks show up, they're oh, I did this at whatever treetop zip line experience is, which really is bringing us to the very individual aspect. And often we use challenge courses in a community development and education setting, which is both increasing access and a way to have these experiences. And I think because there is that big field of use, and it's also increasing some developments in technology that can be very helpful to us in the broader field of use of challenge courses and challenge course structures and spaces. I think it is where we put these parks and how we use them is continuing the who is able to use these and who is it designed for.
If the growth is in the pay to play model, really if that's the place that's big, most easily accessed by a larger subset of the US population. However, it takes me back to when the French military stripped out parts of the natural method, where it's just an individual fitness component. So the three of us go to, as friends to a park, adventure park, and we go through the trails or whatever at varying degrees of difficulty. Maybe we're having a bonding experience, and we're getting physicality out of it. Not that it's necessarily training us to become better combatants at war, because that's not the goal anymore. But I suspect part of the better combatants at war was learning how to be a good teammate. And, part of a patrol or a battalion or whatever that is also a different kind of community building. But if those pieces are lost, like the French military's experience when Afghanistan started, they had lost the community aspect of their training development. They lost the team component. So I think that's where programs like many of our listeners have an opportunity to reclaim that. I wonder, though, if the cost of building courses is prohibitive, meaning that money shows up in certain communities and it's often second to other things, right? You got to have a library before you can, build a challenge course in the community or whatever. So they do show up in wealthy, affluent communities around the US. And how do we make sure that more courses are getting to different communities, but they're big ticket price items. They're either if you're in an urban setting, there are no trees. So by default, almost, because the urbanization of the environment people are in, you have less access to space that you can construct it in. And then if you got to put it on poles, it costs more to put it on poles. So all of that amplifies the lack of access.
I think it's also the thing of is it appropriate access too, of the part of the origins of outdoor education. I think as Phil you were mentioning earlier is was both also outdoor education and adventure education works in a white community culture space as a way to teach values because of our community's values and white culture values. But is the way that we use these things and the way that we use a challenge course a culture match outside of white culture and the white the military culture that we design these challenge courses in and how we've modified and adapted it since. We continue to use the same values and structures within it. And while it works and we see the match in that community that it came from, does that mean what do we need to change as practitioners about that structure and that space for it to be a cultural match in other communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see, the commercialization of modern rock gyms struggling with that very same question. I think the listeners are interested. There's a place called Memphis Rocks in Memphis, Tennessee, that is a commercial climbing gym that is very integrated into inner city, urban, predominantly Black neighborhood. And they do amazing work using sort of what we would think of as a rock gym, but finding ways to make it make sense within that cultural setting. And it's taken lots of different kinds of shifts in people's perceptions of what it is and how people engage with that. So I don't know if there's something we could learn there from this field, from their modeling.
Well, awesome. Chris, Christy, I am going to conclude us partly because of time, but I encourage listeners who were interested by the concepts, some of the details that maybe you're unaware of, to continue that conversation, continue the research. I will include, if it's okay with you, Christy, some of the notes that you shared with us around some of the details so people can access them, a visual medium.
Yeah.
And I will add, Christy, your email to the description if that's also okay, so people can reach out and ask more questions. Because I think it's awesome that you've taken some of that time to look into this and start sharing this. And I encourage us all to have this mindset that we can certainly learn from the past, and we don't want to necessarily perpetuate things that maybe were done in the past. As we move into the future, that we can challenge some of these what can be considered norms of the industry and start working better in terms of the communities we work with. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Christy. And I'll see you on the next one.